Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. I'm your host, Killian Hobbs, managing editor for Being Libertarian, LLC. As always, you can follow all of our podcasts on the Think Liberty Network. You can follow me personally on Facebook there with just searching Killian Hobbs author. And there's all of our different social media feeds, etc., etc. I still haven't started on Twitter. I keep mentioning that I'm going to start doing that, and people can follow me there, but I have yet to do so. Combination of I just have very little interest in the platform, and I'm also somewhat lazy. Anyway, moving right along. I'm going to get into today's episode here. This actually is something that I think would be interesting to take a look at from the both not just the libertarian perspective, but also just a futurist perspective. I've recently finished reading a book called Quality Land. For those of you that are unaware, it's a fictional piece detailing a far but not too far flung future where the internet's exploded even beyond the levels that we understand now, and our technology has greatly advanced as far as drones and super intelligent AI, and a lot of humanity's thinking has been offloaded to algorithms, AIs, and everything else like that. Now, throughout the book, you follow a couple different characters. The main character you follow is a guy by the name of Peter Jobless, because in this one they've relabeled everything to be quality. They got rid of the super. They made it all superlative, so you're not in the, you're not in a good country. You're in the goodest country. They always put everything to the maximum that way in it. But a lot of things are set in there where they trying to figure out the best way to start it off. There's a lot of topics that are tackled in this book, so I should probably start from the most basic. As I said, he's follow a main character by the name of Peter Jobless. Part of the book, or part of the idea of the book, is that everyone's last name, as part of these cultural and country changes, is that everyone's last name is based on what jobs they have. So if you're born to people who don't work, you are a jobless. If you are born to chefs, you are so-and-so cook. And so on and so on. Very, not too different from the way that a lot of our names actually came to be. If you really get into the history of a lot of last names, looking at all the Smiths out there. But I digress. In this book, it's a far but not too far flung future where technology has taken over every feasible aspect of human life. Their class system and wealth system and all that's been replaced with the idea of a leveling system that takes something like 40 different aspects of human life and actually ranks them to assign you a readable level that can be used to change the type of access you have, the type of opportunities that are given to you, so on and so forth. One of the things that's a pivotal point in the book is that the main character there receives an item that he doesn't want. Now, it sounds like that wouldn't be a big thing. However, through a very satirical way, the book goes through why it's so difficult for him to return it, and the fact that they really can't allow him to do so because of what it would mean to the system. Now, I'm not going to spoil the entire book or go through all the different details here, because there's a lot of world building that you kind of have to take in as it goes along. The book definitely has a pretty heavy-handed lean or bias towards the way it views these things. But for those of you that are interested in the book, I'm not going to completely spoil it. But the book does raise one idea, or a couple ideas, I should say, that I think are worth discussing, especially considering how close we are to seeing them implemented now. One of the topics that it talks about is internet monopolization based on the way algorithm feeds work. So the idea is that, the internet is supposed to give us an abundance of ideas. It's supposed to open up the marketplace, give us all these different concepts. But in reality, we know who the tech giants are. And it's not like new tech giants are popping up every day, or, the market shares are fluctuating vastly left, right, and center. No. If anything, it's continuing to shrink year over year over year as companies buy up other companies, or the rankings and market shares just slowly but surely inch their way towards the prevalent companies. I mean, what started off as a completely open, the World Wide Web, where there's millions and millions of options that are out there. And sure, those options continue to grow and continue to expand day in, day out. But even with that, the way that search algorithms, sharing algorithms, all of the background thinking that websites and the like use to try to put the content that we think we want in front of us, it leads to monopolization, even if that's not by intent. Let's use, I'll use Google as an example. I mean, Google's become so synonymous with the concept of a search engine that we literally tell people to Google it. It's as synonymous as Q-tips are to cotton swabs. It's not something that we actually think of as a separate company or a separate entity. It's an action in and of itself. It's become a verb. That's how prevalent the idea of Googling something is. But Google is not the only search engine out there. Google's not even the only one out of 1,000 search engines that are out there. But it became the most prevalent because early on, it proved its worth as a great website for it. Originally, it was ad-free, no weather, no clock, no anything to bog down the main page. It was just quick, easy, simple search engine. And it had very intelligent crawlers that made what you were typing in less relevant. You didn't have to use very specific language in order to get the results you wanted. You didn't need to have a full understanding of how Boolean search terms worked or anything like that. You could just type in a question and you would get the most accurate answer from the internet. That was the idea. It was simple. It worked. But because of that, when people are looking on other search engines or like trying to find out which one they want, the more people that are interacting with Google leads to Google being put in front of more people's eyes. It's a continuous cycle, the way that a lot of these things work. We see this with certain popular websites, for example. Reddit shot up because a whole bunch of people started going on Reddit, using Reddit, creating subreddits, so on and so forth. And it started off with a relatively small community. However, that continuous engagement led to it being put in front of more people's eyes, which then led to more engagement, which then led to it being in front of more people's eyes, so on and so forth. And then it worked its way up to being one of the other, social media giants that are out there. Similar thing with Wikipedia. Wikipedia, because of how often it was used, how often it was updated, and how often people were choosing that link on search engines, it became the biggest encyclopedia. Now, this all sounds fine and dandy. However, when we take a look at how we search for things or how we're trying to find information, we run into the issue of not being able to find the other options after the fact. Realistically, how many people would have heard of DuckDuckGo outside of the big anti-censorship push that happened a couple years ago? I had never heard of them. I only came across the concept of DuckDuckGo as a search engine, specifically because of how many people were naming it as an alternative to Google for everyone that was against Google censorship. Had that whole censorship crisis thing never happened, I would have never heard about it. Because I, like most consumers, have no reason to search out this alternative platform if I've got one that works and does exactly what I need it to do. The majority of people are not going to have a reason to find something that isn't Google. The majority of people aren't going to have a reason to find a video streaming platform that isn't YouTube, unless they just got really tired of the subscribe to premium pop-ups and they really want to get away from that. And it's enough to make them abandon everything that YouTube has. It's the same thing that and get tired of Facebook constantly, but it's the site that continuously gets put in front of people's faces. It's became so prevalent that it gets so many more people invited, so many more people linking to it, that it has the billion odd users that it has. I'm sure if you take away everyone's sock accounts, it's still an impressive number, but that's beside the point. What I'm getting at here is, in the digital landscape, we have to think of the concept of monopoly differently, because what we're exposed to is based entirely on what the algorithms tell us we should be exposed to. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because we could say, there's definitely evidence of different types of business practices that some of the tech giants use to make sure that they remain in the top spot and kind of suppress any of the potential opposition. That does exist. That's not what this episode's about. I want to talk about the more automated processes, the ones where you don't really need to tinker with it and it's still going to reach this final result. For example, if you spend, when you're online and you're searching for different things, if the majority of your search results or the majority of what you are searching leans a certain way, if you're more likely to, click the, let's say, Mother Jones over the New York Times, then when you search a topic, you're more likely to see Mother Jones as the option because that's the sort of content you engage in. Similar thing on Facebook. Facebook used to be, in my opinion, a lot better when they had the same kind of feed style that Twitter had, where it was just chronological all the way down. Now they try to tailor your timeline so that it's the most relevant items. So the groups that you most interact with, the pages you most interact with, the people you talk to the most, and also, more importantly, the key terms that you usually say or click on or like or whatever else have you. The platform makes a point of putting the content that you interact with in front of you the most often, which means that you're less likely to be exposed to differing political opinions, differing economic opinions, differing tastes. I hope you can see where I'm getting at with this. By default, because the way that we've chosen to have these algorithms set up, the way that we want, or at least that we've been told we want by the tech giants we've selected, and ultimately we have to remember we selected them. It's not that they came in and just took up the position. We, through our usage of their products, put them in the places they are. That's on us. But it's through these algorithms and through these systems that they've created that we create these little echo chambers for ourselves. We only ever really see ourselves exposed to, by and far, the type of content that we are interested in. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably interested in libertarian politics on the internet. You're probably interested in economics, particularly pro-capitalist economics, or at least pro-market economics, because people need to remember there's a difference between capitalism and markets. You can have markets without capitalism, but that's again an argument for a different day. The end result in this is that you end up having choices eliminated for you. There's things that you might not think of trying or think of looking for, simply because the way that information is exposed to us now, unless you're actively hunting to get outside of that bubble, you're not going to know what exists outside of it. You're not going to see those options. There could be a page out there on, let's say, Facebook, for argument's sake, that has 12 million followers and posts exactly the type of content you like. But because of the way that they word it or the things that they say, you're never going to come across it. You could have a deep love of physics, but you don't really follow or interact with any type of physics pages, so you don't know that they're out there or exist. You don't see them. Meanwhile, because you commented on 7 or 8 different pages involving arguments about Austrian economics, your entire newsfeed is nothing but updates from your family and pages and groups about Austrian economics or things that are very close or related. Same thing we see in search engines. Based on the total aggregate use of search engines, with a little bit of tailoring for your own personal usage, as I mentioned earlier with the Mother Jones example, the majority of what you see on search engines is based on the aggregate results. So, for example, when people search Donald Trump, the first thing they're going to come across is news articles related to Donald Trump from the most popular news sources. So they're going to see it from CNN, they're going to see it from Wall Street Journal, New York Times, MSNBC, and then generally, depending on which region they're in, that'll tweak the ranking of a couple of sites. You're more likely to see New York Times over MSNBC if you live in New York. If you live in Canada, you're going to see, news articles from your local or at least your regional news. So up here we see Global TV and CBC and CTV and different things like that. Now, when you're going through that, a lot of it is probably going to be negative. Once you get a little past the news, and obviously past the obligatory Wikipedia link that always finds its way to the first page of Google, once you make it past that and get to other results, you're going to find a lot of negative options, because there's a lot of people that search for and create content based on Donald Trump being an idiot, Donald Trump being a misogynist, Donald Trump being a racist, so on and so forth. You're going to find those are as the initial results, simply because of the way that aggregate knowledge works. So that means that a lot of the information that's presented to you as a standard truth doesn't necessarily have to be true. Now, again, purpose of the episode is not to argue the validity of some of the claims against Trump. Some things are true, some things are false. Not the purpose of this episode, just using him as an example. But the fact of the matter is, if you're looking him up and you have no opinion of him, and you just want to find out more about the guy, these are the things that you're immediately going to be presented with. These are what are going to be viewed as the core opinions, simply because they're the mass opinions. And that's another issue that we have with trusting our information and handing so much of what we do with markets and everything, with the market of ideas and even the companies and entities and platforms that we interact with, trusting so much of it to algorithmic systems to make the decisions for us, puts us in the situation that if we don't know what we're looking for, or we don't have any idea going into it, we're not necessarily going to get the right answer. We're going to get the most popular one. Or as the algorithms advance and get a little more customized and start really digging in on user data to start going through the things the user's trying to find or look for, then we are going to start seeing a lot of things that put us in a bubble. Both of those are problematic. Either you end up in a bubble or you end up with the mass opinion. Both of which, depending on how you got there, are going to be presented like they're facts. Neither of which should be accepted, especially considering how much there's the push against, fake news and all that still persistent all these years after the campaign rallies finally died down in 2016. It's still a constant concept of fake news and trying to fight fake information on social media and all that. When again, even with the fact checkers that you see on Facebook, they'll fact check satire, and still it'll negatively impact the reach of those pages because they dared to post satire in a certain way. And then it comes down to how do they decide which content deserves it, which content doesn't. Well, the way that they decide that is based on what type of content gets flagged. And then the type of content that gets flagged for satire, whether it's satire or not, tends to be the type of content that the people that would flag content would flag, as redundant as that sounds. So you see that with a lot of left-wing groups doing mass flags, mass reportings on different content simply because they disagree with it. Now, you could say that Facebook has a bias and is generally in agreement because a lot of the people that are majority shareholders are in agreement with those types of politics. Even if you remove that, though, because it's not like they're standing there right next to the computer pressing the button to make it happen, their algorithms are set up in such a way that it's going to be based on what type of content gets reported. The machines learn from that and then follow through. So this is something that we see when we see a lot of what we call media bias, or a lot of system biases, different things like that, where it looks like we have all of this information, all of these options, but we're being given such a narrow sliver of what is actually available out there. I mean, had it not been for, I can't remember the guy's name at the moment, so forgive me, but had it not been for the one guy, the Chinese businessman, breaking so high into the top billionaire list, how many people in the West would have heard of Alibaba? And just to clarify, that's not the character from Aladdin. That's a massive online sales platform like eBay or Amazon or one of them. The term wouldn't have even come up. People wouldn't have found it or started using it outside of, China and the Middle East and that whole section, that whole cross section of Asia. People wouldn't have really been using it had we not forcibly been exposed to his existence. And that's despite the incredibly low prices that they have, the bulk purchasing options, which, anyone that has a Costco membership loves the idea of buying in bulk. You'd think that would be a type of product that people would become more aware of and more easily become aware of it. But it all comes down to whether or not it ever reaches our eyes. And the way that it's set up is that you can't just throw an advertisement out there and anyone will see it and then potentially it'll bring in who you want. All the advertisements are targeted. All your search results are targeted. All of the news is written nowadays with certain keywords and certain phrasing to make sure that it shows up more often in front of certain types of people's eyes. Not necessarily everybody's eyes, but so that it's more appealing to the types of individuals that the algorithms model themselves off of. Sure, it's based on aggregate information, but the aggregate information also paints a picture of the average user, in which case they'll use that information to try to tailor their content to that average user. So we're left with the question of what do we do knowing this? We know that the recursive elements of network marketing and letting algorithms decide how they're putting things in front of us leads to more monopolistic tech companies, which then, of course, feed the algorithm again because that's what made them popular. We see that through this type of information control and this automation of information access, that we're left with either a bubble of information to work with, or we're immediately shooed in with the majority of results on information. We're not necessarily given the full access to information that we really need. Even which friends we see on social media feeds, or which pages, which groups, which ideas, all of these things aren't really things that we pick to see because of how complicated these systems are and how much of them end up being automated. My question with all this is, how do we get our access back? How do we reclaim our ability to search this information out and find what we're actually looking for, or find different results? And I do have some solutions that I can suggest. One, actively search for it. Actively search for, not just, you don't just search Donald Trump or Donald Trump news or something like that. Search Donald Trump accomplishments, Donald Trump failures. What happened with, this situation? Dig deeper on it, because you might come across an article that talks about an incident involving one person doing such and such, and then all of a sudden you've got an opinion of that person. But if you actually search the situation itself, like actually search for the incident itself and go through it all, it turns out to be a nothing burger. It's like the Lincoln Memorial kids. That was a whole big thing, blew up, everyone had an opinion about it, and then you actually find out what happened and you go, oh, wait, these kids were literally just sitting there, and then they started getting yelled at by the black Israelis, and then the native guy came around and started banging the drum in the kid's face. And all he could do was just kind of sit there and smile like he had no idea what to do. And then it just became the poster child of all of, everything hateful in America, apparently. Good thing to know, too, is that he won the defamation suit. He had put a defamation suit out against a couple of the a couple of the news companies that had published disparaging remarks, and well, it was kind of proven that they were all in the wrong. And it was a situation that it didn't take a whole lot of time for people to figure out what was actually happening. But the amount of people that still, even now, despite the defamation suit that some people don't know even happened, again, going back to the type of information that people are presented with, even with that information, there's still people that think that it was all the kids' fault, despite very clear evidence breakdown and timeline of what happened being out there and available. It's just that people lost interest, so the algorithm moved on, which also means the window of focus that everyone cared about moved on. It's how we moved on from the Jeffrey Epstein thing so quickly. Now, people noticed that the window was starting to shift, so they fought back by making constant commentary about it to keep it in the limelight. But otherwise, the public window moved really quickly on it and just kind of shifted itself away. Same thing with the shift from potential World War III over to coronavirus. I mean, it's hard to believe that last month people were talking about how they were going to get drafted and sent off to war because it looked like World War III was imminent. That was a month ago. But that's the kind of power of the presentation of that information. So like I said, one of the things we can do to stop that is having more specific searches for information, taking that extra step to get to the actual bottom of something before we let ourselves get fully absorbed in whatever the topic of the day is. And also just not getting absorbed in the topic of the day to begin with, because that's where you start to see your newsfeed getting flooded with a certain idea. And it's just because that's the hot topic of the day. So this is where everybody is going with it. Everyone's arguing it. Everyone's talking about it. If you keep your searches outside of that bubble, outside of that constant, I don't know, the internet equivalent of water cooler talk, really. If you keep yourself outside of that, then whatever your digital imprint is that the algorithms try to tailor themselves to won't quite get sullied as much. I mean, you're still going to get exposed to it because that's just how the systems work, but it does help to dilute it a little bit. Another option is going full Luddite and just giving up the concept of an online life, but with the way technology and everything else is advancing, it doesn't really seem like that's going to be an option in the future. The one last thing, though, that really not so much gets me, but gets me with this use of technology and the way that things go with it is there's a certain existential question left to it, because you end up with your personality, your information, your mind being shaped by a recursive algorithm. The things you think, the things you talk about, the things you're aware of, because your information is limited and narrowed through these small windows that come out based on however the algorithm has shifted itself to the type of information that you should or should not receive, that creates a feedback loop. If you're only ever exposed to your own ideas, you're only ever going to believe that your own ideas are there. You see the same thing in political commentary, even sans internet, where there's the idea of the Overton window, where the general political discussion only takes place in such a small bracket, but the small bracket is treated as if it's extreme left to extreme right, despite the fact that there's so many other ideas on all the ways out and around that window. But it's just the small open window of acceptable public debate. So a lot of groups, both far left and far right, talk about how to shift that window towards their direction so that even when they're losing, they're not losing as badly as they were if it was further in the other side's camp. But we can take that past just the political and realize that that's what we've done. That's what we do with our internet experience, just automated. It doesn't come out from what newscasters are saying or just from what politicians are saying. It's the same idea applied to absolutely everything. Like, I'll use another example. Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is an okay book series, one in a long line of stuff that George R. R. Martin's written. And if I'm being frank, his sci-fi is probably better than his fantasy. I know I'm going to get a lot of hate from people for saying that, but it's true. A lot of his sci-fi, I would say, is probably better written than his fantasy stuff. They created the TV show. TV show took off, but because it was on HBO, because of certain key elements that made people really hunt it down and look for it, it turned into a giant cultural phenomenon. Simply because when people started talking about it, posting memes about it, all the other stuff, that helped it go viral. And as soon as it went viral, it became standard as far as what the algorithms were picking up and trying to put in front of people. But the other thing that's interesting, using Game of Thrones again, is how quickly it disappeared. Last 2 or 3 episodes of the show were terrible. The ending was atrocious. And then it was completely gone. The show, everything on it, everything about it, it seemed to, its entire cultural significance evaporated practically within a month after its ending, because people were that soured about it and just wanted to move on. And so they did. They just did. 8 years, the show was one of the forerunners of television, of conversation. All references would go back to it, everything else. 8 years was erased in a month. Sure, people remember the show existed, and for those that watched it, they'll be able to go back and remember such and such a scene. Occasionally you see a meme out there that references something from the show, so on and so forth. But for the absolute juggernaut that it was, within a month it was just poof, gone, disappeared. Everyone moved on with their lives as if it never happened. The fact that that can happen that quickly, with that much just in one ear, out the other, it's gone, just based on the type of information that's presented to you and bombarded at you day in, day out, that should be cause for concern. The one last thing I'll leave you with on this whole concept, something to think about at least, was, when was the last time that you tried to get outside the bubble of what's presented to you? What I mean with that is, sure, we'll explore different ideas, we'll talk about different concepts, everything like that, but when was the last time that you took a subject completely out of left field, completely unrelated to any of the stuff you normally talk about, and then just tried to learn more about that? You know, you might spend all your time, say, online or with friends or whatever else. You're either talking about your job, maybe sports, and then probably politics, economics, if you're listening to this type of podcast. But you ever stopped and just said, you know what? I want to know more about biology today. Or finding out a little bit more about local news, local history. Trying to find out a bit more, let's say, breeds of dog. I don't know. I'm just throwing random concepts out there. But just trying to pursue that completely different piece of information and then starting to post about it, talk about it, do all that, just to see how your experience online shifts. If you spend a month talking about a completely random different subject, then you're more likely going to see advertisements related to it. You're going to see suggested groups pop up or suggested pages pop up that are more related to that particular topic. If you start following a page or two, then a whole bunch of your newsfeed is going to start getting bombarded with information related to this stuff, in which case a lot of it will start coming to you. The only thing to keep in mind when it does that is that the information that's coming to you, it's already gone through an algorithm. So you don't know how much of that is inside that tiny little window and how much of that is actually coming from outside. I guess the total message with this is, like any other type of swindling, just because we've automated it and it's not a human doing it, doesn't mean it's not happening. We already know the media will try to restrict the type of discussions and opinions that are brought to the public eye, and they'll try to chase the things that are the most popular. That's been happening since newspapers became a thing, because that's how you sell them. Same thing with television, same thing with radio, same thing with just politicians arguing with each other. They know what's going to be acceptable, or at least they have an idea of what's acceptable to the general public, in which case they will argue their points but try to stay inside that frame. People have been trying to stay inside of what's appealing forever and a day. The only difference is that we've automated the process, so it's done for us. When in reality, especially with how narrow things are getting and how divided things are getting, we need to blow that box up. And the only way to do that is to be conscious of it and try to work actively to stop ourselves from being snared in it. That's all I have today on the topic here. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you have any questions or concerns or anything like that, feel free to send me a message there. Go to the Killian Hobbs author Facebook page. You can send me a message just through the messenger there. Or if after listening to this episode, you don't want to spend all that much time dealing with Facebook or trying to feed your information into it, then by all means, you can skip ahead and send me an email at killian.hobbs@beinglibertarian.email. So that's all. Like I said, that's all I got for today. So if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.